There was once a man who crossed the ancient world without a helmet, without a trumpet, and without a claim to any throne. He did not march at the head of an army. He did not build walls or force cities to bow before him. What he carried instead was lighter than bronze and more dangerous than steel. He carried curiosity. In the age of kings, curiosity was a strange kind of courage. It had no banners, it often traveled alone, and yet it could move farther than any army because it could slip through gates that violence could not open. A curious man could sit with priests, traders, sailors, shepherds, temple servants, and old men who still remembered the smell of war. He could listen where conquerors only demanded. He could ask why, where everyone else seemed satisfied with who had won. That man was Herodotus. He grew up in a world that had learned to live in the shadow of empires. Men spoke of Persia as though it were too large to measure, of Egypt as though it had been old before the Greeks were young, of Babylon as if it belonged half to the earth and half to legend. Beyond those names lay deserts, river kingdoms, steppe lands, unfamiliar rituals, and peoples who seemed to obey laws older than language. Many men would have stayed home and spoken of these places with the certainty of those who have never seen them. Herodotus preferred another method. He went to cities where the stones held heat long after sunset. He went to places where rivers ruled more completely than kings. He listened to stories that contradicted one another. He heard things that were exact and things that were improbable, things dignified and things absurd. And he did not throw the world away simply because it refused to become simple. If that labor sounds modest beside the noise of empire, it is only because noise usually makes a better first impression. But the man who listens carefully may preserve more of the world than the man who tries to own it. So tonight, we are not entering the ancient world as judges, nor as debaters, nor as students in the ordinary sense. We are entering it as late-night listeners. We are stepping onto a road beside a man who loved asking questions so much that the question itself became a way of life. We are going to move slowly with him through Egypt and Persia, through Babylon and the old Greek lands, through stories of kings who rose too high, cities that imagined themselves eternal, and peoples who seemed to live beyond the reach of ordinary explanation. Before Herodotus became a name handed down through centuries, he was simply a man standing at the edge of the known world, feeling that there must be more to understand. Not just who fought whom, but why so many peoples became enemies. Why fortune never stays where it is invited. Why one side calls another barbarian when each believes it alone is speaking in a human voice. Those are large questions, and because the night asks for a slower wisdom, we do not need to settle those questions too quickly. It is enough, at first, to walk beside the wondering, to feel how a single patient question can carry a traveler farther than certainty ever could. Too large to answer in a single place. And so, rather than beginning with a battlefield, let us begin where Herodotus himself often seemed happiest, at the threshold of wonder, in a land where stone and sunlight had already agreed to remember one another for thousands of years. Egypt was a good place to begin, because Egypt did not merely look old. It seemed to operate according to an older rhythm than the rest of the world. On one side lay the dry silence of the desert. Through that silence moved the Nile, dark and steady, making a narrow ribbon of fertility through a land that might otherwise have been all glare and dust. Villages, fields, sanctuaries, workshops, tombs, and royal dreams all leaned toward that river. When Herodotus arrived there, he was not entering a mere foreign country. He was entering one of the oldest acts of collective imagination ever sustained by human beings. The Egyptians had taken flood water, mud, ritual, geometry, labor, kingship, and death, and from those materials they had built a civilization so confident in its own forms that it could make a mountain of stone and call it a tomb. The pyramids are the first great shock, however often they are described. They still remain partly outside language. A traveler may speak of height, polish, shadow, angle, and labor, Yet all of that still circles the thing rather than entering it. The pyramids do not ask to be admired, they simply remain. And then there are the priests. Herodotus did what he always did when placed before greatness. He did not stop at staring. He asked questions. How had these things been built? Who had ordered them? What did the Egyptians remember, and what had they chosen to forget? He listened to temple memory, to translated accounts, to old explanations guarded by men whose authority rested not in physical force, but in continuity. There is something wonderfully sleep-heavy in that image. A traveler standing among the monuments of Giza, while old men speak to him of kings long dead, of labor measured not in days, but in generations, of purposes that once seemed urgent and now survive only as stories. One can almost feel the afternoon heat lying over the stone. Yet even here, where the world seems made of permanence, Herodotus is not satisfied with marvel alone. Egypt teaches him a lesson that will shape all the journeys to come. Grandeur and explanation are not the same thing. A thing can be magnificent and still leave the mind restless. A civilization can appear perfectly ordered and still contain mysteries, contradictions, and arguments beneath the surface. He wants more than marvel. He wants connection. He wants to know how one world touches another, how old grievances become new wars, how stories change when they cross borders. So let the first image remain simple. A traveler in Egypt, bright stone, slow river. Priests speaking from the shelter of memory, and somewhere inside that stillness, a question beginning to sharpen. Why had the peoples of his world become enemies? That is not the sort of question one asks only once. It follows a man from city to city. It turns travel into inquiry. And if we are to follow him properly, we must leave the pyramids for a time and turn toward the restlessness of memory, where every people has a version of how the trouble began. When Herodotus asked the Persians why Greeks and non-Greeks regarded one another with such suspicion, he did not receive an answer shaped like a clear line. He received a chain of remembered injuries, a string of old abductions and retaliations, a pattern of offense answered by counteroffense, until no one could easily say where justice had ended and habit had begun. This is one of the most human things in all of ancient history. People like to imagine that wars begin with one decisive act that any fair observer would immediately recognize. Yet most long hostilities begin the way family resentments begin, with stories that accumulate and harden. One side says, they took first. The other says, no. They answered what had already been done. Somewhere in the middle, memory becomes a court with no judge. So the old tales were told. A woman carried away by traders, another taken in return. A princess stolen across the sea. A grievance preserved not just as an event, but as a moral account waiting to be balanced. Names changed depending on who was speaking. Details softened or sharpened according to pride, but the emotional shape remained the same. Each side believed it had inherited not merely a quarrel, but a record. And records, once sanctified by repetition, are very difficult to silence. Herodotus listens to these stories the way a good night traveler listens to the wind through different houses. He hears their tone. He notices their claims. He also senses that no single version can satisfy him. It is not enough to know that one people blames another. He wants to know why blame became a tradition. That desire sets him apart. A lesser teller might have chosen the neatest account and laid it before his audience like a finished object. Herodotus does something more interesting, and in its own way, more restful. He allows complexity to remain complex. He lets contradiction stay visible. He reports what he hears, but he does not surrender his mind to the first voice that sounds confident. So, after receiving one account, he asks again in another place. After hearing a Persian explanation, he considers what Phoenicians might say. After hearing that a woman had been seized against her will, He hears an alternative in which she left willingly, or at least not unwillingly enough to fit the moral frame that later generations preferred. This does not solve anything. It deepens everything. The result is not confusion in the cheap sense. It is a richer kind of uncertainty, the kind that makes a story feel more alive because it admits the presence of competing human motives. Pride, shame, desire, convenience, political memory, and the need to explain present hatred through old events all begin to move together. It becomes harder to say, here's the beginning. Instead, one begins to sense that every beginning is also a revision. Still, Herodotus does not linger forever in the midst of old tales. He moves, as he often moves, from mythic memory towards something closer to recognizable history. Perhaps, he seems to suggest, the true deepening of hostility came not in the age of legendary kidnapping, but when power began pressing against freedom in ways men could still remember more plainly. That brings us to Lydia. If old stories formed a kind of haunted background music to the Greek imagination, Lydia gave that music a stronger beat. Lydia stood close enough to the Greek world to matter immediately. Its kings had resources, appetite, and proximity. Its wealth shone brightly enough to attract admiration. Its ambitions reached far enough to inspire fear, and in the figure of one Lydian king, the abstract question of tension between Greeks and outsiders becomes startlingly concrete. The first serious hand laid upon Greek freedom, Herodotus suggests, may not have come from the deepest past at all. It may have come from a ruler of immense luxury, living in a court where fortune seemed so abundant that it had begun to look permanent. That idea is important because it shifts the center of the story. We leave behind the half-lit world of remembered insults and move toward a more intimate and more dangerous setting. A royal house, a hidden shame, a line of kings, and the slow ripening of a curse. If conflict among peoples can begin in disputed memory, it can also begin in private sin. And when it does, history often enters the room not through a gate, but through a bedroom door left open at the wrong moment. Before there was Croesus, before royal wealth in Lydia became almost proverbial, there was a king whose downfall began not with policy, not with war, but with vanity made intimate. He loved his queen's beauty too much to keep it private. There is something almost dreamlike in the way such ancient stories are preserved, as though the world itself enjoys reminding us that great dynasties are sometimes undone by the most foolish impulses. This king, secure in his power, trusted one of his closest companions so completely that he wished to share with him what should never have been turned into a demonstration. He wanted proof of his wife's beauty, not praise, not rumor, not poetry, proof. So he arranged what should not have been arranged. He compelled another man to look where honor demanded blindness. The trusted companion resisted, as any decent man would resist. But kings are often most dangerous when they mistake obedience for affection. What the king desired was not enough for himself. He wanted it confirmed. The queen saw what had happened. In histories of empire, we often expect turning points to arrive with armies and proclamation. Yet here, the hinge of a dynasty lies in a silent recognition. A woman, humiliated in the most private corner of royal life, understands at once that the order around her has been broken. From that moment, the story no longer belongs to the king who thought himself safe. It belongs to the person who has been wronged, and to the witness who now understands he has been trapped inside another man's shamelessness. What follows is one of those stark ancient choices that feel carved from stone. Kill the king and take both throne and queen, or die at once. It is a choice shaped by survival rather than virtue. The trusted man becomes the reluctant instrument of political change. The king who arranged the violation loses both his life and his dynasty, and thus a private indecency opens into public consequence. Herodotus understood the force of such stories. He knew that listeners are drawn not only to the scale of kingdoms, but to the fragile rooms in which kingdoms are quietly decided. Power is never merely abstract. It breathes through households, through habits, through permissions that should not have been granted. A court may look stable from the outside, while, deep inside, shame is already at work sharpening a blade. The new ruler, however he came to power, could not entirely escape what had created him. Oracles and inherited guilt hover over the story like distant thunder. A wrong may be politically useful and still remain morally unsettled. The generations that follow may seem to prosper, yet somewhere beneath the polished surface, a debt waits with unusual patience. This is the sort of pattern Herodotus notices again and again. Men rise through accident, violence, cleverness, necessity, or the strange demands of circumstance. Later, ages simplify the rise and call it destiny, but the old stories remember the discomfort. They remember the stain beneath the purple cloth. They remember that beginnings matter, even when later success appears to erase them. For a while, of course, the new order holds. Cities are brought under control. Power extends. The machinery of kingship continues as if it had always belonged to the men now operating. One generation leads to another. Names pass like lamps from hand to hand. Some rulers add little. Some prepare unknowingly for those who will come after them. The line survives long enough for the original crime to begin fading into family distance. And then at last we arrive at the descendant whose name glows brightest in memory. Croesus. With him, the old curse will meet wealth so dazzling that it seems capable of defeating fate itself. Lydia will shine. Sardis will become a place of fascination. Greeks will visit its court. Treasure will gather until abundance appears almost natural there. Yet the deeper logic of the tale has already been set in motion. The listener who remembers the queen, the hidden witness, the murder, the transfer of power, understands something that Croesus himself does not yet understand. Fortune can inherit consequences it did not personally earn. That is why the story of Croesus works so well when told slowly, in the quiet voice of evening. We know before he knows. We can hear, beneath all the bright surfaces of his reign, the low continuing murmur of earlier wrong. We know that opulence is not safety. We know that splendid courts have a way of amplifying human delusion rather than curing it. We know, even before Solon arrives, that the richest room in the world may still be built over a crack. And so, once the throne has changed hands and the generations have done their work, a king stands in Sardis surrounded by magnificence, asking not how to rule better, not how to live more justly, but how to be named happiest among men. That question, gentle though it sounds, will prove heavier than gold. Croesus is one of those figures who seems, at first glance, to have arranged life in the correct order. Wealth first, splendor second, admiration third, security all around. His capital gleams. Learned Greeks visit his court. If human satisfaction could be built from visible abundance, he would have possessed the formula. But abundance creates its own vulnerability. It surrounds a person with agreement. So when Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, came to Sardis, Croesus asked him who the happiest man was. Surely, Croesus thinks, the answer will come in the shape of his own name. But Solon answers differently. He names another man, then others, and praises lives completed honorably, rather than lives merely shining in the present. The king wants praise for his current condition. The wise man speaks of endings. Croesus does not like the lesson. To accept it would be to admit that every feast in Sardis stands on a floor that might give way without warning. It would mean that wealth offers comfort, but not verdict, luxury, but not guarantee. Soon the lesson grows heavier. A dream comes. A beloved son is marked by prophecy. Croesus does what frightened, powerful men often do. He tries to outmaneuver fate with arrangements, precautions, and protection. Yet, to watch a ruler try to organize his way around destiny is to watch a man building corridors in a burning house. Then comes the hunt, not a battle, a hunt, a guest with blood on his own past, a throw meant elsewhere, a fatal accident. Iron finds the sun after all. Now the king who measured himself by abundance discovers the poverty of power before loss. There are griefs no treasury can soften. For a time, Croesus recedes into mourning, and Solon's words, once irritating, begin to gain weight. Then the world shifts again. Cyrus of Persia rises. Croesus seeks divine guidance before war and receives the sort of prophecy pride loves most. If he attacks, a great empire will fall. He hears what he wants to hear. He imagines the empire to fall will be Persia's. So war comes. Sardis cannot keep fortune loyal. The king is taken alive. His fate narrows toward fire, bound upon a pyre, with death suddenly near enough to give thought a terrible clarity. Croesus remembers Solon. This is the moment that matters most. Croesus does not remember Solon in triumph. He remembers him in defeat, when only truth remains capable of standing upright. Happiness cannot be named in the middle of possession. It must be measured against the end. The king on the pyre finally understands. And because Herodotus loves stories in which understanding arrives at the edge of ruin, that understanding itself becomes part of what saves him. Cyrus hears the tale and is moved. The fire, the plea, the reversal of intention, the possibility that heaven answered with rain, whether one reads it as miracle or legend, the meaning is plain enough. Power is unstable. Fortune migrates. Croesus, who once wanted to be named happiest, survives not as a monument to wealth, but as a lesson in the limits of it. And after such a lesson, after prophecy and grief and almost fire, the mind needs somewhere gentler to go. It needs room to breathe among customs rather than crises. The old world becomes easier to bear when seen this way, not as one unbroken chain of shocks, but as a breathing alternation between danger and custom, pride and household routine, prophecy, and the small repeating gestures by which people make life livable. That is how, after tragedy, we return to safety. The Persian world, seen at a calmer distance, does not first appear as an army. It appears as a pattern of habits. This is one of the great consolations of Herodotus. He may tell of campaigns and punishments and kings who imagine themselves larger than fate, but he also knows that a civilization is made of smaller motions. How people greet one another, how they drink, what they consider shameful, which things they praise in children, what they borrow from neighboring peoples without embarrassment, which acts they forbid not only in practice, but in speech. A world discloses itself in gestures long before it explains itself in philosophy. So after the blaze of Croesus's downfall, let us walk more quietly for a while through Persian customs. Imagine men meeting one another according to rank, the body itself becoming a language of hierarchy. Imagine decisions discussed first in sobriety, and then again under the warm influence of wine, as though reason might need to be tested by a second atmosphere before it can be trusted. Imagine a people deeply alert to lies, suspicious of debt, because debt so often tempts the tongue toward falsehood. Imagine a society expansive enough to borrow what it admires from others without feeling that admiration weakens authority. Clothing, armor, habits of elegance, practical arts empire absorbs as easily as it commands. Even the way Persians imagine piety differs from what a Greek might expect. There is less need for enclosed temples and carved divine houses. Worship may rise on high places under open sky, where mountain, plain, water, wind, and sun remain more difficult to separate from reverence itself. It is a spirituality that can feel at once simpler and more vast, less concerned with enclosing the sacred than with approaching it. Then come the domestic priorities. Sons are highly valued. Birthdays are celebrated with an importance bordering on ceremony. Meals reveal temperament as much as taste. The Greeks, in Persian eyes, seem not to eat enough to honor a meal properly, while the Persians themselves give generous space to wine, conversation, and the social theater of the table. One begins to see how each people constructs normality around its own satisfactions. Herodotus is especially good in these passages because his curiosity is active without being frantic. He notices, he compares, he lets the oddity of a custom remain visible, yet he does not flatten it into mockery. He understands, perhaps more deeply than many of his successors, that difference is not a problem to be solved. It is a fact to be entered with attention, and attention, late at night, can be wonderfully soothing. It is soothing to picture rivers treated with reverence, not casually defiled. Soothing to imagine laws that do not permit the immediate destruction of a servant for a single offense, as though justice must at least pause before it becomes irreversible. Soothing, too, to feel the quiet surprise of discovering that a people known to the Greek world as imperial and formidable also lives by routines that are unexpectedly intimate and recognizably human. The Persians become less a distant threat and more a civilization with its own interior logic. That matters. Once enemies are granted interiors, history becomes softer around the edges. Not less real, not less tragic, but less simple. The old division between Greek and barbarian begins to lose the harshness of pure contrast. Everyone, after all, lives inside a structure of meanings that feels obvious from within. And this is one of the reasons Herodotus remains such a gentle guide at night. He does not keep the mind braced for impact. He knows when to leave the pyre and return to the table, when to step away from the cry of kings and notice the customs of households. In his company, catastrophe is never the only rhythm. Observation, texture, and ordinary life are allowed to quiet the pulse again. So let us linger a little longer among these Persian scenes. A father proud of his sons, a gathering on a hillside under open sky, men drinking and debating by lamplight, courtiers measuring distance through ritual, borrowed garments admired without shame, water protected, speech regulated, truth cherished, at least in principle, with enough seriousness that lying becomes not merely a fault, but a stain. In these moments, the empire is not marching, it is breathing, but no breathing space in Herodotus lasts forever. The road extends, another city waits, another civilization prepares its own contrast, another set of customs, more remote and perhaps more bewildering to Greek eye, stands beyond the Persian world, like a wall of fired brick beside a river. And so, once the mind has softened again, we move eastward and southward into Babylon, where magnificence and strangeness seem to have entered a pact of mutual exaggeration. Perhaps that is why these quieter passages matter so much. They remind us that no empire is made only of proclamations. Someone must still pour the wine. Someone must still teach the child. Someone must still distinguish proper speech from forbidden speech, honorable conduct from shameful conduct, old custom from borrowed elegance. Even at the height of power, life is lived in repeated details. Seen this way, Persia becomes less like a single marching force and more like a world furnished from within. The mountain worshipper, the court official, the father proud of many sons, the guest at a long meal, the man who fears debt because debt bends the tongue, the rank-conscious courtier who can read hierarchy in the angle of a greeting, all belong to the same living system. And once a listener can feel that system breathing, the later conflicts lose some of their flatness. They become the meeting of whole interiors, not just the collision of flags. Babylon rises in the ancient imagination like something halfway between a city and a declaration. To speak its name is already to invoke scale, walls so broad that the mind grows skeptical before it grows impressed. Gates that suggest not mere defense, but confidence bordering on theater. A river cutting through the city, as though urban life and flowing water had decided to inhabit the same body. Streets, storehouses, houses of many stories, and a sense that the whole place has been designed not only to endure, but to astonish. Herodotus, when faced with such a city, does not rush. He lets its dimensions accumulate. That is one of the pleasures of his method. He understands that wonder requires pacing. A city becomes more immense when described by circling it slowly. Moat, wall, inner divisions, river, gate, habit, market, custom, memory. Only after enough layers have settled does the full impression begin to take hold. And as always, he notices that magnificence alone is never the whole story. There are customs in Babylon that strike him as admirable, strange, unsettling, or all three at once. The sick, lacking physicians in the formal sense, may place themselves where passers-by can advise them from personal experience. Illness becomes a public exchange of remembered remedies. There are people whose diet appears to Greek eyes astonishingly narrow and inventive, drawing sustenance from fish, prepared in ways that make a meal sound almost like a craft. There are marriage practices and market procedures that reveal a society regulating intimacy with a severity that can feel both orderly and brutal. This is what Babylon does in the imagination. It enlarges everything. The city is large. The customs feel large. The contrast with Greece feels large. Even the oddity of ordinary life seems architecturally scaled. At night, it is easy to imagine the place becoming still without ever becoming silent. Water moving under the dark lamps in upper rooms. Gatekeepers listening to the distance. Somewhere a household finishing bread. Somewhere else someone carrying news of trade, tribute, insult, debt, illness, or royal expectation. A city this great cannot sleep all at once. It sleeps in districts. Perhaps that is why it also seems so vulnerable to hubris. Great cities begin to imagine that their size is a form of protection. They believe breadth can substitute for caution. They gather provisions, strengthen walls, trust in stores and engineering, and reputation. Sometimes this trust is justified. Sometimes it becomes the prelude to surprise. For Babylon stands not only as a marvel in Herodotus' world, but as a prize. A city so rich, so fortified, and so symbolically charged could not fail to draw the hunger of empire. To possess, it was not simply to add another territory. It was to place one's hand upon one of the ancient world's grandest assurances of permanence. And there is always a danger when ambition reaches toward permanence. It mistakes endurance for invitation. We can feel that danger gathering as we move through Herodotus' Babylon. The city seems too complete, too protected, too aware of its own greatness. It waits behind its gates with the confidence of a place that has forgotten how inventive desperation can be. There is almost a drowsy confidence in such certainty, the confidence of those who believe that what has held for a long time will continue holding simply because it has done so before. Yet history, especially in Herodotus, has a taste for indirect entrances. A city may fortify its walls and neglect the waterway passing through its own heart. A defender may mock a besieging king, without imagining that mockery can buy time, but not insight. A ruler may trust the visible perimeter, while overlooking the roots hidden inside routine. Human beings tend to guard against the shape of danger they already know. The most effective threat usually arrives in another shape. So Babylon, for all its mass, begins to feel suspenseful, not because its walls are weak, but because they are so impressive. We begin to ask, as listeners do in the half-dark, if such a place can fall, how does falling begin? Not with thunder, perhaps. Not with one clean blow. More likely with patience, with someone watching the city long enough to notice the movement of the river. The habits of the defenders, the confidence of those inside, the path by which impossibility may be reduced to timing. Before that moment comes, however, it is worth lingering once more in Babylon's peculiar humanity. A city is never only its walls, it is also the way people marry, heal, bury, bargain, and endure. It is the way strangers are astonished by it. It is the way its inhabitants mistake custom for inevitability. It is the way a great urban body learns to carry both wonder and moral discomfort inside the same skin. And because Herodotus is never content with mere admiration, he lets the city stand long enough for us to love its scale and question its soul at the same time. That doubleness is important. It prepares us for the next movement of the story. For once, Babylon has become real in our minds. Once we have walked its imagined streets slowly enough to feel its density, the question changes again. No longer merely what is this city like, now it becomes who will dare to take it, and what kind of ruler believes even Babylon belongs inside the circle of his appetite. That ruler is Cyrus, and with Cyrus, the road reaches for the edge of empire. Cyrus enters the story with the energy of a founder, one of those rare rulers who seems able to convert momentum into structure. Around such men, territory begins to gather almost as weather gathers around a mountain. They inherit one realm, add another, then another, until the map starts to look less like a collection of countries and more like the outline of a will. Yet Cyrus is never entirely simple in Herodotus. He is formidable, but still recognizably human. He can admire a defeated king. He can also be ruthless, ambitious, and convinced that there must always be another horizon worth crossing. Babylon's fall under such a man feels, in retrospect, almost inevitable. A city of impossible walls meets a king, patient enough to seek an impossible entrance. Water becomes the path. The defenders are not weak. They are simply outmaneuvered by imagination joined to determination. And once Babylon is taken, Cyrus gains more than a city. He gains aura, but greatness is greedy for continuation. The empire expands until it reaches peoples who do not live as cities live, and do not offer resistance in familiar forms. Beyond the settled grandeur of older kingdoms lie open spaces, wandering tribes, and rulers whose authority grows from movement rather than wall. Among these peoples stands a queen. Tomyris is impossible to patronize. Cyrus first approaches her through the soft language of marriage, but she understands at once what lies underneath. A proposal from a king of expanding empire is rarely innocent. She refuses. Refusal is often the true beginning of war. A trap is laid using appetite itself. Food, wine, luxury, the unfamiliar pleasures of settled abundance. An enemy force is drawn into carelessness through indulgence. The victory that follows feels less like clean prowess than like calculated distortion. And because Herodotus is too alert to irony to let such a move remain uncomplicated, the trap produces not closure, but escalation. A son is taken from a mother. Shame compounds grief. What is won tactically is lost morally. Tomyris hardens into a clarity far more dangerous than wounded pride. What follows has the shape of retribution. The bargaining fails, the captive is lost. Battle comes in earnest, and the empire finds itself facing a people who will fight without reverence for Persian majesty, under a ruler whose grief has distilled into purpose. Cyrus is at the edge of the world he sought to enlarge. The founder of a vast empire, victorious over kings and capitals, brought down not in the polished center of civilization, but in a harsh frontier war among people, the imperial imagination may have underestimated. Some traditions add the unforgettable image of Tomyris giving the dead king the blood he had seemed to thirst for. Whether one receives the detail as history or moral legend, the meaning is plain enough. Conquest, carried too far, may finally meet an answer proportionate to its appetite. The important thing is not to make this section loud. Why? It does not need loudness. Its power lies in distance, open land, hard light, horses breathing in the cold edge of morning. A queen who understands the stakes before the king does. An empire pressing outward until it reaches a people not easily impressed by empire. And then, Because Herodotus always seems to know when the mind has spent enough energy on crowns and violence, he turns back toward observation. He lets the listener step away from the battlefield and back into older fascinations: rivers, rituals, burial, labor, and the strange dignity of foreign habits. After the edge of empire, he returns us to Egypt, and Egypt, encountered again after so much ambition and blood, feels even more dreamlike than before. To return to Egypt after kings and campaigns is to step from argument into atmosphere. The mind relaxes almost immediately. The Nile takes over. Rivers have a way of restoring perspective. They nourish fields without caring which king claims the harvest. They invite observation rather than panic. And for Herodotus, the Nile is never just a piece of geography. It is one of the great explanatory presences in human life, a moving source of civilization, and a puzzle that stirs thought as gently as it stirs reeds along the bank. The Egyptians live differently because the river allows them and requires them to live differently. That difference appears in the smallest details first. In who does which work, in what is treated as public and what is private, in the habits of cleanliness, in ritual shaving, in the garments of priests, in the handling of food, bodies, tools, and sacred animals. A Greek traveler might feel that Egypt has taken many familiar arrangements and reversed them, not out of perversity, but out of long confidence. This is simply how things are done here. Animals are not merely animals. Some become vessels of reverence. Cats are mourned. Dogs are honored. Pigs are shunned, except under very specific religious conditions. The line between daily life and symbolic life is thinner than it appears in more casual societies. Even cleanliness has a devotional texture. Cups are scrubbed, linen is kept fresh. Priests maintain their bodies with meticulous care. It is as if purity has migrated outward from temples into the routines of ordinary existence. Herodotus is delighted by such details. He understands that to know a people, one must know not only their wars, but their hands. How they carry, wash, mourn, weave, worship, and bury. To see the world this way is to treat custom as a kind of local philosophy enacted without announcement. At the center of all this stands death, or rather the refusal to let death become mere disappearance. Egyptian mummification can become strangely calming when told with the right cadence. Not gruesome, not clinical, but patient. The body is prepared. The corruptible is confronted methodically. Perfume, linen, drying salts, wrapping, containers, chambers. The dead are not hurried away. They are arranged into endurance. Then Herodotus turns from what humans have made to what the land itself has made possible. The Nile floods, the Nile withdraws, the Nile feeds without it. Egypt is unthinkable. Herodotus wonders about the river's source and its flooding because to explain Egypt honestly, one must explain its water. He hears theories, repeats them, judges some silly, others attractive, others insufficient. The search itself matters as much as the answer. Here, the journey slackens in the most welcome way. The river widens, oars move slowly, afternoon light settles across the flanks of temple walls. Questions about source and flooding do not arrive like blows. They drift, as river questions should drift, outward into distance. So imagine Egypt not as a set of facts, but as a sequence of textures. Cool water touched at dawn, linen drying clean in the brightness, priests moving without haste, sacred animals crossing a courtyard, a family grieving a cat, a workshop preparing a body for its long interior voyage, silt-rich fields waiting after the flood, a traveler asking where the river begins and finding that every answer leads farther into distance. After the sharper energies of royal downfall and frontier struggle, Egypt offers another sort of grandeur. Meaning comes gently here, through recurrence, through water, through ritual, through the feeling that civilization itself may be nothing more than a patient bargain between mortality and order. one begins to understand why the Nile could seem not merely useful, but sacred to the imagination. And once the listener is fully resting inside that rhythm, we can go deeper into Egypt still, because beyond the rituals of daily life and burial stand the great works of Egyptian imagination. Pyramids, labyrinths, impossible labor, and the old desire to build something so large that the future would have no choice but to notice. If the Nile explains how Egypt lived, its monuments reveal how Egypt wanted to be remembered. This desire to remain is everywhere in the Egyptian imagination. It is there in tombs, in ritual, in the treatment of the dead, in the architecture that seems determined to outwait the weather. But nowhere is it more visible than in the great constructions that cause even a seasoned traveler to feel his scale reduced. The pyramids are the obvious center of that feeling. Even to speak of them now is to risk sounding either too plain or too grand. Yet, perhaps that is part of their genius. They resist style. They do not need ornate description, because their form has already achieved what most monuments only hope for. It is complete enough to silence embellishment, a line rising from a wide base toward a point, a mountain translated into decision, geometry made devotional. Herodotus, hearing Egyptian accounts of their making, enters a world of labor so vast that it becomes almost abstract. Teams of workers, stone drawn from afar, causeways prepared, blocks raised by devices and planning, and accumulated effort. Years not as occasional burden, but as a building material in themselves. The mind grows sleepy under the weight of such duration. 10 years, 20 years, generations leaning their strength into a project whose full form they may never see completed. It is one of the gentlest forms of awe, because the monument stands still, while thought slowly expands to fit it. There is also hidden within the admiration a darker undertone. Grand constructions are rarely innocent. They arise from command, extraction, taxation, coercion, and the strange royal conviction that private mortality may be answered by public burden. Herodotus knows this. He understands that a pyramid is both marvel and cost. A listener should feel both, without being forced into argument. Let the two truths remain side by side, beauty and the labor that purchased it. Then there is the labyrinth. If the pyramids embody concentrated certainty, the labyrinth embodies extended bewilderment. Endless rooms, upper and lower levels, passages that seem to generate more passages, courtyards leading into chambers that lead into still more enclosed spaces. A structure so complicated that walking through it becomes a form of surrender. One loses not only direction, but the expectation that direction will soon return. In the quiet of such description, the building begins to feel like a material version of memory itself, full of chambers, dead ends, recoveries, and sealed places one is not allowed to enter. Herodotus' fascination with it is perfectly understandable. A traveler who loves stories would naturally be drawn to a structure that behaves like a story told by corridor. Here one turns and finds another chamber. There another turn opens onto a court. One level is visible, another withheld. Tombs lie beneath. Kings linger in absence. Stone multiplies. The mind grows pleasantly lost. And because Egypt never seems content with one grand gesture when several are possible. There is also the artificial lake, the imagined scale of water held and shaped by design. Pyramids rising from within it, seated figures watching above the surface. Whether every detail stands as literal report or as wonder enlarged by retelling matters less than the impression it leaves. Egypt appears to Herodotus as a land where human order, if made vast enough, might almost converse with the horizon itself. This belief does not stop at building. It enters stories too, tales of thieves clever enough to outwit royal precautions, of treasure chambers, traps, disguises, severed identity, and kings who admire the intelligence of those who wrong them. Such tales show another side of Egypt, not only monumental and sacred, but sly, playful, full of wit hidden inside hierarchy. Civilization is never one mood for long. that variety matters. After so much ritual, river and stone, a quieter note of cunning and human warmth enters the old country. A story about a thief does not have to be loud to remain memorable. Told softly, it becomes a candlelit anecdote in the middle of greater grandeur. A reminder that even under pyramids and palace systems, ordinary cleverness still glimmers. Still, no land remains protected forever by its own magnificence. However old the temples, however impressive the tombs, however subtle the priests, the wider currents of empire eventually reach Egypt as well. The Persian world that once felt distant now leans southward. The ambitions inherited from Cyrus do not rest content. New rulers rise, new campaigns are imagined, advisors betray, routes are opened through desert and diplomacy. The old kingdom, for all its age, must face the appetite of a power convinced that even ancient sanctity can be entered by force. This shift should come gradually, like a wind altering before anyone names the storm. For a moment, then, let Egypt remain suspended between calm and threat. River country and imperial target, land of ritual and coming disturbance, soft with water and linen even as history gathers at its edges. So while Egypt still glows in the mind as a country of river mist, sacred animals, linen, tombs, courtyards, and unhurried labor, let another note begin sounding underneath. Not loud enough to disturb the calm, only steady enough to suggest that no civilization, however old, ever lives entirely outside history. Soon Persia will come in person, and with Persia will come one of the more sorrowful patterns in Herodotus, the meeting between ancient ritual order and the unstable mind of a conqueror. And yet, this very determination to endure may be what makes Egyptian grandeur so moving. The builders seem to know, at some deep level, that human life is brief. Their answer is not resignation. Their answer is form, if flesh fails. Let stone persist if a king dies. Let a line, a chamber, a causeway, a burial ritual, a mountain-shaped tomb continue speaking in his place. Even if the speech grows faint, it will still be more durable than breath. There is something almost tender in that stubbornness. Human beings, aware of death, making wait their reply. Cambyses, son of Cyrus, inherits more than a throne. He inherits momentum. This is not always a blessing. Some men rise by founding, others rise by receiving what a founder made. The second kind often lives under a different pressure. He must not only rule, he must prove worthy of an inheritance already enlarged by another's greatness. Egypt becomes the object of that pressure. Herodotus preserves several threads around the Persian move against Egypt's personal insult, broken trust, resentment at court, the role of defectors and advisors, routes negotiated across difficult country. However the pieces are assembled, the effect is the same. A civilization long established and deeply self-assured finds itself approached by an imperial force, both practical and relentless. There is sadness in this even before battle begins. Egypt is ancient, ceremonious, rooted in river and memory. Persia arrives with a younger ferocity, broader logistical reach, and a political imagination trained on acquisition. These are not merely two armies confronting one another. They are two rhythms of civilization colliding. The conquest itself need not be shouted to feel terrible. Betrayal matters, roots matter, advisors matter, misjudgments matter. When the campaign turns against the Egyptians, the defeat feels not sudden, but prepared by previous fractures. A kingdom may be old and still be vulnerable to one wrong ally, one insult handled poorly, one enemy guided by a mind that understands where the defenses truly fail. And once the Persians take hold, the conflict moves from war into humiliation. Punishments multiply, symbolic gestures matter, the dead are not always left in peace. We begin to see in Cambyses a restlessness, not satisfied by victory. He seems driven to violate meaning. as well as territory. Then comes the failed push farther south, toward lands at the edges of the imaginable. Ethiopia glimmers before the Persian court as a place of distance, wealth, and difficult access. Envoys are sent with gifts, but the ruler there sees through the performance at once. It is a striking scene, almost quiet in its superiority. A great deal of imperial theater collapses when the audience is unimpressed. Still, Cambyses presses on. Armies move into difficult country, supplies dwindle, animals are eaten, then other measures follow. Hunger changes the moral climate of an expedition with frightening speed. By the time retreat begins, the campaign has become a lesson in overreach. There are places the imagination may conquer sooner than the body can. Yet the inward collapse of Cambyses seems even more disturbing than the outward failure. Returning to Egypt, he sees celebration and interprets it as mockery. A festival becomes an insult, priests become liars, sacred forms become targets, violence enters ritual space. Whether every later detail about his madness should be read as exact history, or as the moral memory of those who suffered under him. The portrait remains powerful. A ruler increasingly detached from proportion, a king who kills too near his own blood, a man who confuses fear with evidence, command with truth, impulse with right. This section must be handled carefully. It contains some of the darker material in the whole arc. The trick is not to remove the darkness, but to let it pass by in a low, steady cadence. Madness is often most chilling when described without strain. A dream misread, a brother resented, a suspicion acted on too quickly, a wound returned to the body as though fate had chosen an exact place to make its comment. When Cambyses dies, he leaves behind not a calm transfer of order, but the feeling of a throne surrounded by uncertainty, secret, imposture, and the aftershocks of fear. And so the Persian Empire, though still enormous, enters another phase of instability. New hands reach for power, rumor matters, identity itself becomes uncertain. After Egypt, after overreach, after the slow spectacle of a mind narrowing under suspicion, we are ready to step back into the broader expanse of the empire itself. But the Persian world under Darius will feel less like a single man's fever and more like a map stretching outward in many directions at once. After confusion comes arrangement. That is one way to understand the rise of Darius, not as peace exactly, and certainly not as simplicity, but as the reassertion of structure after the anxious distortions left behind by Cambyses. The throne passes through doubt, impersonation, noble conspiracy, whispered knowledge, and the dangerous question of who is truly who. In such moments, an empire feels less like a solid edifice and more like a stage on which costume and authority have become alarmingly difficult to separate. Herodotus is deeply interested in these passages because they reveal how fragile political reality can be. The great empire, vast in land and armed men, may still depend upon recognition. If people believe the wrong person sits on the throne, the consequences become real regardless of the hidden truth. Power requires bodies, yes, but it also requires agreement about name. So the episode of the false ruler matters not just for its intrigue, but for what it says about imperial life. Distance makes deception easier. Court secrecy distorts visibility. Even the dead can continue governing by a resemblance. Eventually, of course, revelation comes, a private sign, a remembered mutilation, a noble daughter's dangerous role, testimony, confession, violence. The imposture breaks, blood answers uncertainty, and from that convulsion Darius emerges as king. With Darius, the Persian world seems to widen again. The energy changes. Where Cambyses felt inwardly unstable, Darius feels administratively expansive. He belongs to the category of ruler who sees territory not merely as possession, but as something to be organized, numbered, divided, and made to speak in tribute. Under such a king, empire becomes legible to itself. Districts are defined, taxes flow, routes matter. The map acquires bureaucratic rhythm. This too can be strangely soothing to listen to at night. Not because administration is thrilling, but because it offers pattern after turbulence. One can almost imagine messengers moving along roads, officials noting quantities, local rulers negotiating expectations, tribute arriving in different forms from different lands, gold dust from one quarter of the world, aromatics from another, fabrics, livestock, metals, spices, stories. Empire becomes not only conquest but circulation, and what a circulation it is. India appears on the far horizon like a cluster of worlds, rather than a single one. Different tribes, different foods, different ways of treating illness, age, and death. Some live in marshy places, some roam, some organize life around habits so unfamiliar to Mediterranean listeners that they seem to belong to rumor more than reality. Herodotus does not tidy these people into a single picture. He reports their variety. That is one of his quiet virtues. Distance often tempts simplification, yet he resists it enough to let eastern lands remain plural. Somewhere in those regions lies gold, or stories of how gold is gathered, protected, pursued, and risked for. Great creatures, or creatures made great by retelling, disturb the edges of description. We enter one of those classic Herodotian borderlands where the real and the marvelous lean close together without ever fully becoming the same thing. The exact line between report and rumor grows soft, and the imagination is allowed to travel with it. Arabia, too, enters the imperial picture with its own perfume. Fragrant raisins, spices, difficult harvests, guarded groves, creatures that seem to stand between commerce and myth. The farther south and east the journey goes, the more the world takes on the mood of an old map whose edges are warm with caravan dust, barter, incense, and cautious exaggeration. Under Darius, all these lands become connected by the idea of empire, even when they remain culturally distant from one another. That is perhaps the most important feeling to preserve here. Not just that Persia was large, but that it gathered astonishing difference into one political frame. India and Arabia, palace and desert, noble revolt and district tribute, truth claims and rumors of what? Marvels all coexist under the same royal name. Yet, the breadth of empire never abolishes resistance. It only changes its scale. The wider the map becomes, the more edges it has. And edges are where self-confidence meets refusal. They are where the imperial center discovers that distance is not merely geography, but temperament. A ruler may divide lands into districts. That does not mean those lands have begun to imagine themselves in the same way. Soon Darius will learn that lesson in the north, among peoples who move too freely to be pinned down by the habits of imperial command. But before that, let the image of his empire remain suspended for a little while. Longer great roads, tribute, aromatic wealth, eastern rumor, and the hum of administration following hard behind the noise of succession. This is the Persian world at one of its broadest moments. And because it is at its broadest, it is already approaching the limits of what breadth can hold. Darius also brings with him a different kind of imagination, one more patient than the frenzy of suspicion, and more interested in arrangement than in theatrical outrage. This does not make him gentle. It makes him durable. Under such a ruler, distance itself becomes a problem to be solved rather than merely a horizon to be admired. Roads become arteries. Tribute becomes rhythm. Information becomes a second form of possession. The empire under Darius begins to resemble a net cast widely across diverse world. And every knot in that net is a people with its own customs, gods, climates, fears, and desires. That is what makes the whole thing so impressive and so precarious at once. North of settled luxury and south of absolute certainty, lies the restless country of peoples who do not make empire comfortable. The Scythians belong to that category. They are difficult for organized states not merely because they fight, but because they live in ways that evade the habits of conquest. They move, they carry their world differently, they do not offer cities to be besieged in the ordinary manner. Their dead are honored through rites as severe as they are memorable. Their courage is displayed in forms that horrify outsiders and satisfy insiders. To hear Herodotus describe them is to feel the Greek imagination meeting a society both recognizable and profoundly alien. The Scythian world is best understood as texture before argument. Open grasslands stretching farther than a king's certainty. Riders appearing and vanishing. Sacred practices carried out not in marble enclosures, but under wide sky. Feasting, burial, movement, horse culture, war custom, rough honor. The whole northern country feels windswept rather than settled, and that very quality makes it difficult for empire to grasp. Their rituals around kingship and death are especially striking. Royal bodies do not disappear quietly. Grief becomes public, physical, communal, prolonged. The dead ruler continues to shape the living through ceremony, transit, sacrifice, and memory. The scale is not monumental in the Egyptian way. It is mobile, raw, and bodily. One civilization wraps and seals, another cuts, scars, buries under open land, and remembers through ordeal. Such contrasts are exactly what make Herodotus such a rich guide. He shows us that human seriousness can wear wildly different forms. Darius, confident in his reach, eventually turns towards such northern peoples, with all the familiar assumptions of empire. Roads can be followed, enemies can be found, submission can be demanded, water and earth can symbolize surrender. Yet the Scythians answer in a style that frustrates every habit of central power. They refuse the tidy battlefield. They retreat, circle, disappear, provoke, delay. They let space itself fight on their behalf. This is a subtle but profound kind of resistance, not the loud heroics of one decisive stand, but the patient refusal to become available on imperial terms. As a result, Darius experiences one of the recurring humiliations of large states. He can enter a land without truly possessing access to its people. He can march and threaten and send messages demanding combat or submission, yet he cannot force his enemy to value the things he would normally destroy. No cities to burn, no crops to seize in the expected manner, no walls whose fall would symbolize victory. The Scythians have placed their vulnerability elsewhere, in ancestors, mobility, and endurance. To conquer them, one would have to find what they love, and what they love is not easy for an outsider to locate. There is a beautiful calm in that idea. A people survives because it has arranged its life in a way that does not offer obvious purchase to power. So let the horses move, let the Persian columns lengthen and tire. Let messages pass between rulers across distance. Let the northern air feel thin and dry. The Scythians do not defeat Darius through one theatrical clash. They do it through patient space and refusal, which is a slower and, in some ways, more unsettling form of strength. Far to the southwest, Libya offers another sort of edge to the known world. Here again, Herodotus gathers tribes, local customs, marriage rituals, festivals, hair arrangements, painted bodies, stories of animals, and those half-believed accounts by which frontier geography always thickens into wonder. Libya in his pages is not one thing. It is a sequence of neighboring differences, each tribe making life according to its own inherited pattern. Some customs seem almost playful, others ceremonial, others startlingly intimate. The farther one travels from imperial centers, the more confidently humanity multiplies its ways of being. After the strain of royal madness, succession, and great campaigns, these frontier sections offer a different pleasure. They stretch the world sideways, History is no longer only the story of capitals. It belongs to lake shores, grazing lands, painted bodies, marriage rites, local gods, seasonal festivals, and communities whose names survive mainly because a curious traveler took them seriously. In that sense, the edges of the Persian world are also the edges of Herodotus's gift. He can stand where certainty frays and still keep looking. He can admit marvel, doubt, rumor, pattern, and direct observation into the same frame. He can treat the world's fringes not as empty margins, but as places where the variety of human life becomes impossible to ignore. Yet, even while the empire strains toward these outer horizons, something more dangerous is forming closer to the Greek world. Because whenever great powers expand, local resentments accumulate in the spaces between command and obedience. Coastal cities grow restless, ambitious men gamble, appeals are made, revolt begins to imagine itself, and once revolt appears, the old question with which Herodotus began the question of why Greeks and non-Greeks became enemies returns with sharper consequence than ever before. There is another reason the Scythian episode lingers in the mind. It suggests a kind of freedom without turning freedom into an abstract speech. The Scythians preserve what matters to them through mobility, memory, and refusal. They know what must be protected, and they refuse to display it in forms an enemy can easily seize. Libya, meanwhile, softens the northern severity with a different kind of distance. Lake shores, tribal ceremonies, women displayed in festival brilliance, painted bodies, local beauty judged by local standards, stories of extraordinary animals wandering the margins of probability. Here the world feels less harsh than elusive. Herodotus looks west and discovers, once again, that the earth is more various than any city imagined. The road back to Greece does not begin with a grand invasion. It begins with grievance, ambition, and the unstable chemistry of smaller powers living beneath a great one. A city tyrant fears punishment, another seeks opportunity, a failed expedition leaves embarrassment behind, appeals are carried across the sea. Sparta hesitates, Athens listens differently, and all at once a regional disturbance starts pulling larger worlds into a line. The Ionian cities, Greek in language and memory, but long exposed to Persian rule, become the hinge. Their unrest is political, practical, emotional, and symbolic all at once. Some leaders act from fear, some from calculation, but history is often moved by mixed motives toward outcomes cleaner than the motives themselves. Athens sends ships. There is something quietly fateful in that. A few vessels, launched from one city, may one day be remembered as the beginning of a war that changes continents. Sardis burns, a local revolt becomes an offense against Persian prestige. Darius notices, Darius remembers. The empire, which had tolerated many complexities so long as obedience ultimately held, now turns its eye toward retribution. Yet Herodotus does not rush us directly from revolt into famous battles. He lets the scale adjust, counterattack, suppression, the crushing of resistance, the knowledge in Persia that Athens has crossed a line, the knowledge in Athens that Persia will not forget. Then Marathon. Marathon is best remembered in strokes of concentrated clarity. A plane, a landing, a city deciding not merely whether it can fight, but whether it can bear not to fight. The Athenians choose to meet danger rather than await it, and the modest scale of the field only sharpens the force of that decision. So let Marathon unfold in measured strokes, the plain open under hard light, the armies closing, the Persian confidence that numbers and habit will carry the day, the Greek confidence, quieter and more desperate, in close order and momentum, then impact, then astonishment, then the realization that an empire can be resisted, not in legend, but on a real shore. The Persian wound at Marathon is not only tactical, it is psychological. The empire learns that Greece is not merely a frontier to be corrected. The Greeks learn that Persia, for all its size, is not invulnerable. Time passes, preparations deepen, Darius dies, Xerxes rises. The scale of ambition grows again when the Persian king turns once more toward Greece. The campaign acquires the slow pressure of inevitability. Peoples are summoned from all quarters of the empire. The expedition becomes civilizational, as though Persia means to arrive in Greece in the full visible weight of itself. And yet the Greek answer, at first, is narrow. Thermopylae is one of history's great contradictions. A vast imperial force moving toward a constricted pass. The many delayed by the few strategy becomes almost architectural. A coastline, a path, a bottleneck. Delay purchased by courage. Again, the trick is not to shout. Leonidas and his companions do not need shouting. They need stillness around them, spears angled, messages exchanged. The famous refusal to surrender weapons, sounding less like bravado than like the natural speech of men who have already accepted the shape of their part in events. A betrayal opens the mountain path, so the encirclement comes. The stand becomes final, and because Herodotus understands the emotional geometry of memory, the battle becomes larger in recollection than some victories. Defeat can shine when it purchases morale, example, and time. Meanwhile, at sea, another kind of intelligence is gathering. Themistocles understands that a city is not only its walls. Sometimes to preserve it, one must empty it. Athens is evacuated. Families move away. The city yields its body in order to preserve its life elsewhere. This is one of the most hauntingly beautiful decisions in the whole war cycle. Strategy here becomes an act of care. Then Salamis, once more Greek intelligence, chooses constriction against scale. The Persian fleet, immense but unwieldy, is drawn into waters that favor agility over mass. Confusion spreads, ships crowd the Greeks, better adapted to the shape of the fight, strike. What seemed overwhelming becomes entangled. What seemed small becomes decisive. After Salamis, the rhythm changes again. The Persian king withdraws. The campaign lingers in Greece through generals and remaining forces. Athens suffers, empties, survives, alliances strain and harden. Winter passes, and still, the story need not become harsh to feel large. Even these battles, when told slowly, become shapes in memory more than spectacles of injury. Bronze catching light, dust moving over ground, men holding formation, ships straining at oars, and behind it all the simple refusal to yield what feels like home. Plataea arrives with the feeling of culmination on land. Another test of whether the Greek coalition can remain coherent long enough to make resistance permanent. Positions, pressure, sudden openings, the fall of leadership within the Persian command, the moment at which morale bends and then breaks, and across the sea, the sense that Persian power is losing its grip on the mainland struggle. What matters emotionally is not only that the Greeks win, it is that the shape of possibility changes. The empire that once seemed destined to absorb the Greek world finds its advance checked. The smaller, divided cities discover that under enough pressure, they can form something like a shared memory. For Herodotus, this matters personally as well as historically. He was born into the age made by these struggles. He grew up in the long shadow cast by cities that refused to disappear. And once the great sequence of revolt, punishment, invasion, narrow pass, sea battle, and final resistance has begun to settle into memory, the story turns where it has always been turning, back toward the man who gathered these scattered voices in the first place, back toward the traveler whose patience keeps the whole ancient world from becoming only a noise of force. In the end, after kings have overreached, after queens have answered blood with blood, after priests have spoken in shadowed halls, after rivers have been questioned, cities admired, customs compared, and armies marched, we return to the quietest figure in the story. A man listening. That return matters. Without it, the ancient world risks becoming only a sequence of force. With it, the whole journey changes meaning. The monuments remain impressive, the wars remain grave, the empires remain vast, But all of them now pass through the tension of someone who chose not to let them vanish into noise. Herodotus' own life had its share of instability. He knew exile. He knew tyranny. He knew that cities could become unsafe for the thoughtful as well as for the powerless. That may help explain the tenderness with which he treats freedom, memory, and the vulnerability of cities. He traveled, he gathered, he compared. He watched the world without demanding that it become tidy for him. That is rarer than it sounds. Many people travel only to confirm what they already think. Many listeners hear only enough to strengthen existing loyalties. Herodotus could be skeptical without becoming cold. He could report marvels without surrendering completely to them. He could love the Greek world and still give foreign peoples vivid interiors. He could preserve contradictions instead of grinding them smooth. Eventually, those journeys became a book unlike anything that had existed before, in quite the same way. Not a list of kings, not a bare record of victories, not a hymn of national certainty, something wider and more curious, a work in which geography, anecdote, custom, political cause, rumor, and inquiry all found room to coexist. One can imagine him later in life, perhaps in a Greek city far from the lands he had crossed, shaping that accumulation into spoken form. There is a beautiful possibility in that. A crowd gathered, evening descending, and Herodotus reading aloud stories of Egypt, Lydia, Persia, Babylon, Scythia, Libya, and the wars that had once threatened to drown the Greek world. To hear such a thing would not simply be to learn. It would be to feel the known world lengthen around you. We often remember conquerors first because they rearranged the visible world. Herodotus deserves remembrance because he rearranged the invisible one. He altered what later generations expected history to do. He made room for explanation. He made room for doubt. He made room for the idea that stories about other peoples are worth recording, even when they complicate one's own sense of centrality. There is comfort, too, in the scale of his patience. He does not behave as though one story should cancel another. He does not hurry to make all peoples equal, nor does he rush to make them simple. Instead, he moves among differences with the strange courtesy of sustained attention. That courtesy is part of what makes his company so restful at night. He does not demand that the world flatten itself before he is willing to describe it. And perhaps that is why, after so many centuries, his presence still feels close. He is not close because every report he preserved was exact. He is close because his mind remains recognizable, the instinct to compare, to ask another witness, to report one version and then another, to marvel at foreign practice, to look for causes beneath spectacle, to feel both attraction and uncertainty before distant things. These are enduring human motions. So now, as the roads of the ancient world grow dim again, let them dim softly. Let Egypt sink first into the hush of river water and stone. Let Babylon recede behind walls and moonlit gates. Let the Persian court withdraw into lamplight, wine, and dangerous decision. Let Croesus step once more onto the edge of the pyre, and then be lost in rain and memory. Let Thamyris ride back into the northern distance. Let the ships at Salamis become only dark shapes on narrower and narrower water. And let Herodotus continue walking, not quickly. Let him move the way a true listener moves, with pauses, with questions, with a willingness to stand where the world is complicated and remain there long enough for shape to emerge. If this long, quiet journey through the ancient world has felt comforting, perhaps that is because the deepest night stories are never only about sleep. They are about being carried safely through immensity. They lead us through power, strangeness, grief, beauty, and uncertainty by a voice that does not panic, a voice willing to linger until the world grows gentle enough to bear. And perhaps one gentle question is enough to leave beside you as the night deepens. How did one man armed with no army and no crown, become the reason so much of the ancient world still speaks at all? You do not need to answer now. Perhaps that is the final gentleness of Herodotus. He leaves room around his stories. He does not crowd every silence with explanation. He lets marvel remain marvel, and disagreement remain visible, and the far edges of the world remain faintly lit rather than fully pinned down. It is enough to let the question remain, to let the roads continue somewhere beyond sight, to let the river keep moving in darkness. So if the ancient world still seems vast as sleep approaches, let that vastness remain gentle. Let it be made not of pressure, but of distance, not of alarm, but of dimly lit roads, riverbanks, harbor water, market voices fading after sunset, desert routes cooling after heat, and one thoughtful traveler who keeps walking just ahead of us, never so far away that we lose him, never so close that he breaks the hush. So as the road grows dimmer, there is no need to force an ending sharper than the journey requires. Let the names soften, let the monuments withdraw into distance, let the wars lose their iron edge and become only echoes crossing water and stone, to let the old kings fade without fully disappearing, and to follow that patient traveler a little farther still, until history itself grows quiet enough to sound like sleep, and softer than sleep now. There is also a hidden comfort in the fact that he did not solve everything. He leaves questions open. He repeats stories he cannot fully settle. He allows disagreement to remain visible. For a late-night listener, that restraint is a gift. It means the world does not have to be reduced before it can be held. Mystery itself can be part of the shelter. And maybe that is the final reason his voice still suits the dark so well. He never hurries toward hard closure. He gathers, compares, wonders, and then lets the world remain a little larger than any single telling of it.